Welcome to Podfic a Week, the podcast of fanfiction audiobooks. This week's fanfiction was recently published as part of the One Piece Justice Anthology and is about the bespectacled Navy swordswoman, Tashigi. And now, Heavy Lies the Coat, by ni21. The claws of death were near, she knew it. Had been there one way or another often enough. Cold licked her extremities as the little blood she had left concentrated in her thorax to keep the organs alive, only to seep out through the cut in her side. Hadn't she still been on her knees a second ago, propping herself up on Shigure? She calmed, the sudden panic welling up in her chest. She could still feel her sword in her palm, still at her side. The sun shone brightly above, burned her skin most likely, and still she felt cold. So cold. Smoker's own fight hadn't dragged him too far away. There was still hope she'd be found, and she owed it to herself, him, and the people she fought for, to hold on for a little bit longer. Thoughts were fleeting. As nice as it would be to focus on one and just get lost in memory, she could barely hold on to any of them. Barely scratching the surface of thought, never mind exploring it to the end. The end. It might as well be her end, here, on the beach, where she'd fought side by side with pirates, again. Never would she have imagined that when she'd signed up to join the Marines. Pirates were evil, after all. She scoffed at the unbidden picture of an awkward green-haired teen her memory shoved in front of her eyes, and winced as the motion agitated her nerves enough to bring back the pain to the forefront of her senses. The man brought her nothing but trouble, didn't he? Even when he wasn't around. No, especially when he wasn't. When she couldn't direct her anger and frustration directly at him, that was when she had time to think about the pirate. Tashigi had long since stopped cringing at the thought that she'd like Roronoa back in Logetown. He'd been good company. He'd shown similar respect toward the blade as she did. She would have enjoyed fighting at his side. After she'd realized his true identity, though, she'd hated him, despised him, loathed him. It had to have been a facade, after all. No way a pirate, let alone one with his reputation, could be a genuinely good person. Roronoa had played her, Tashigi had been sure, to crush her, sneaked his way into her good graces to hit her where it hurt. Had he defeated her in battle, she could have lived with that or died proudly, but he hadn't. He'd chose not to fight her, had insulted her, had held against her what she'd been struggling with from the very beginning. Only a truly despicable monster could go so low. Or so she'd thought. Then, he'd saved Smoker and Alabasta, and the crew had saved the whole kingdom, and Tashigi hadn't known what to think anymore. This band of pirates had turned her world upside down. Not just him, all of them. Over and over and over again. Okay? Voices, barely there, just out of reach. Warmth around her, quaking. Marine, are you okay? Weak as she was, she felt her body snap to attention at the tone used on her, the result of years of military training. Could feel the hands on her shoulders, pain flaring from the wound in her stomach as it was met with pressure. Dying on duty, sir? No, not sir. She blinked the world back into focus, ousting the mist of death from over her eyes. A pirate. At the mercy of a pirate again. Pirates. If his hands were on her shoulders, another had to be treating her wound. Alive, she pushed through gritted teeth. The pirate scoffed. Barely. Maybe it was meant as a joke. Maybe she was still too caught up in the things she'd believed in the past. Maybe it had not meant to sound condescending. It wasn't like she was in any form to fight him over it. What's your blood type, Captain? She scoffed this time. She'd heard the stories of the legendary blood transfusions, how Son of the Sea Jinbei had offered his blood to the human pirate Monkey D. Luffy without so much as a second thought. A statement that had rung far and wide that race did not matter. A statement heard by everyone apart from the celestial dragons and the world government. A statement heard by all those who wanted to hear it. It had taken lawless pirates to tell the world that racism was a bad thing, and the ones pretending to keep justice alive, pretending to keep people safe, were the ones that did not want to hear this simple truth. What kind of justice could those people bring? None. None at all. killing off children for the sins of their parents, experimenting on them to get ahead in an endless arms race between the world's forces, researching to create bioweapons of mass destruction that would render islands uninhabitable, as if devil fruits weren't enough of an issue in the wrong hands already. All that while telling the public that they were the good ones, the ones that kept them safe, the ones that would protect them from the filthy pirates roaming the world. When she'd learned the extent of these atrocities on Punk Hazard, the coat had been so heavy on her shoulders, the words burning into her back worse than the frostbite on her shoulder. If that was the kind of government and marine representatives people across the world had to deal with on a daily basis, it really was no wonder that some seemed to rejoice living under pirate flags. All those villages that had been happy to claim they were being protected by the Whitebeard pirates, by that family. A family that, no questions asked, had been ready to take on the whole military force of the world government to save one of their own. Just like that, they had shown the world that not all pirates were ruthless scum, had proven that they held attachments like anyone else, that they were ready to fight for their own and their values. She knew what the war had done, had seen it in her travels, the seed of doubt that had been planted for her in Loketown, had germinated in Alabaster, that same one had been planted in a lot of hearts that day. They had cut the video feed, of course. They had known how bad it would look. But people talked. Soldiers talked. All those poor, traumatized recruits. She groaned as icy sharp alcohol poured over her wounds. The sound amplified in her head as she remembered the moans and groans of maimed soldiers. Soldiers who for the first time had seen battle, yet alone war. That were afraid to close their eyes, afraid of the dark, for the pictures their minds would conjure. For justice. The justice they wanted to wear on their backs. There had been exactly one Marine on that battlefield that understood justice. She swallowed in shame at the memory. That scream of pure agony from the boy that had been deemed just good enough to be kitchen help until Garp had decided to give him a chance. The sound had frozen her blood, rooted her to the spot. The plea for the madness to stop. Kobe had done what she should have done. She'd known since Alabasta that things were amiss. Propaganda was taking them all for fools. She had known that Monkey D. Luffy had his heart in the right place. That day she should have stood on the side of justice, should have stood side by side with Kobe, imploring Admiral Sakazuki to stop this madness. She should have done justice to her coat. Justice. They all wore the words. The higher-ranking Marines all wore that coat with the bold letters. What a farce. What a slap in the face to everyone wronged by them. She shuddered, remembering the terror Axe-Hand Morgan had brought to an entire island. A Marine base should make civilians feel protected, not terrorized. And they would have never learned of it if it hadn't been for Straw Hat. Again. In that instance, and many others, pirates had been the ones that should have worn justice on their backs. Even lying on her back, the coat suddenly felt too heavy to bear. Again. After all the things she'd learned, she should have stood on the right side. Her nose twitched as the familiar scent of too many cigars reached her senses. "You better not die here, Captain." His voice was strained. Worried, most likely. Hadn't seen her like that in quite a while. Punk Hazard, maybe, when the wound was on her shoulder, and the whiplash from being treated like a sack of potatoes by a pirate that just wouldn't let her die had caught up to her. Yes, she'd been saved by pirates then too. Trafalgar Law and Tony Chopper had made it so the scars the harpy's teeth had caused were barely visible now, and her range of movement had not taken a toll. She smiled weakly. "Can't, sir. We still have a job to do, sir." She'd been ready to hand in her letter of resignation after the war. He wouldn't have it. "Can't change the system if you're not part of it," he'd said. She'd felt his pain then, his own weariness, his own doubts, his own disenchantment. He'd looked so tired. "We will change it," he'd assured, himself as much as her. They would. They'd talked a lot after departing for their new positions in the New World. They'd fill those big words on their backs, with their own justice, even more so than before. They all had their own justice. It was something they had to acknowledge. Surely Straw Hat and Whitebeard had fought for justice too. It had felt more just to her during the war, and she swallowed the lump forming in her throat, knowing that she only had a handful of people with which she could voice those thoughts aloud to. Smoker was one of them. His hand was burning on her shoulder, but maybe her body was just growing colder still. Breathing was so much work. She blinked her superior into focus, saw his usually grim facade lined with worry. Had to look bad for him to show concern like that. "We will change it," she hoarsely echoed his passwords back at him. They would. They'd worked too hard to get where they were to give up now, to die here. They'd owed it to all those people that had experienced terror under the unjust boots of Marines that should never have gotten into power. They owed it to themselves. One day, the world would be a better place because of people like them, because of good people, regardless of which coats they wore. This has been Heavy Lies the Coat by ni21. You can find this fic and others like it in the One Piece Justice Anthology, on Twitter at op_justicezine or at op-justicezine.card.co. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here next week for the next Podfic a Week.